Hello there, friends. Welcome back to our book discussion on Eager to Love by Father Richard Rohr. It is our discussion on the life and work of St. Francis of Assisi and Sister Clare, and also mysticism in the early days of the Church, and how we see it reflected in the Western Church and the American Church in particular today. We are still in Chapter 2, the Happy Run Downward, and we're looking at pages 26 through 31, titled The Paradox of Suffering. So without further ado, let's get started. This acceptance of growth through suffering is what gives us wisdom and spiritual authority, and finally teaches us love itself as a gift from beyond. Spiritual authority is the first of all inner authority, but then it can become outer authority, too. Jesus calls this servant leadership, which is his way of speaking of bottom-up and inside-out authority. Such authority might come from the single mothers, happily working 3 jobs to support 3 children, who change our lives much more than the authoritative sermon from the pulpit. These might be the people who can speak with quiet conviction in a way that actually and deeply convicts us. Such inner authority is absolutely necessary to balance an all too common reliance on mere outer authority, which so often creates very passive or very rebellious believers in all religions. The coincidence of opposites, the inherent contradictions that almost always these things carry, is what crucified Jesus, and it is this world of contradictions to which he said yes. If we hang there with him, patiently and prayerfully, holding the paradoxes of every single thing that lives, we will henceforth know, teach, live, and believe in a very different way. Plus, we will enjoy a peace that the world cannot give. The Christian code words for this essential mystery that must always be held together as one are death and resurrection of Jesus. But most Christians just worship this historical event in Jesus and profusely thank him for it, instead of setting out on the same path themselves. It is probably the classic example of missing the major point among Christians of all denominations. We worship revelations out there instead of also recognizing them in here. And the world remains unchanged. The most obvious change that results from such a holding and allowing is that we will naturally become much more compassionate and much more patient. Compassion and patience are the absolutely unique characteristics of true spiritual authority, and without any doubt are the way both Francis and Clare led their communities. They led not from above, and not even from below, but mostly from within, by walking with their brothers and sisters, or smelling like the sheep, as Pope Francis puts it. A spiritual leader that lacks basic human compassion has almost no power to change other people, because people intuitively know he or she does not represent the divine or the big truth. Such leaders have to rely upon role, laws, and enforcement powers to effect any change in others, and such change does not go deep, nor does it last. In fact, it is not really change at all. The authority of being refound, page 28. People, however, who are held to the edge of their own resources, as Jesus was on the cross, and find themselves at an utterly new level, are what we mean by being refound or resurrected. And they say with Paul, I live no longer, not I, but Christ lives in me. Their authority comes from a deeper place and a more convicting place than, I have the right to say this. It feels more like I have earned the right to say this, which has a whole different weight and heft. These are the folks who can heal, reconcile, understand, and change others. Such a basis for authority is universally available, and not in any way the unique province of any one religion, belief system, education, or ordination. It is the authority of having been in the place of no control over the outcome, and then coming out on the other side, larger and more alive, and thus able to invite others into that same and bigger field. Francis and Claire are examples of people who dive into this bigger field of paradox and absurdity with total freedom and choice beforehand, and then the driving, and then the during and the after somehow take care of themselves. Faith does a preemptive strike at both life and death, which makes the rest of the journey of every saint happy. See, I told you so. The pattern of this new kind of authority was taught by Jesus when he said, "Simon, you must be sifted like wheat. And I will pray that you will not fail, and once you've recovered, you in your turn can strengthen the brothers or sisters." This sifting and then recovering is Peter's real and life-changing authority, as it is for anybody. Unless a bishop, teacher, or minister has on some level walked through suffering, failure, or humiliation, his or her words will tend to be fine but superficial, okay but harmless, heard by the ears but unable to touch the soul. It is interesting to me that 12-step programs have come to be called the recovery movement. They are on to something. Page 30. Once we go through our own sifting and recovering, we will have a kind of real inner authority too, by just trusting what we know. It will probably never be an authority that needs to be formally licensed as such, just as Francis and Claire sought no church office or ordination, but instead it expresses an inherent authority to heal and change situations and people, just like the janitor at school with whom the students share their problems, or the single and poor mother who has raised 4 children and is still in love with life. Such is the final tour de force that the gospel offers to the institutions of this world, as they clamor for what is too often false authority. I am afraid you can easily be ordained a minister in most churches, largely by passing tests, and formal ministry can be a mere career move upward, as if, and might be an attempt to avoid all moving downward, as if we could. Do not be shocked, but I suspect some priests and ministers' moral failures are actually very helpful to their own salvation and necessary for their growing up. I have counseled many of them. Francis knew this truth. It is why he did not at first want his order to be priests at all, but, if so, a very different kind of priest who identified with the poor and the weak, and most especially their own poverty. He wanted our authority to be built on bedrock and not on sand. Our Christ reigns from the cross, but with a new kind of power that looks and feels like total weakness, just as all human suffering and humiliation does. Only those who have joined him there and come out on the other side, like Francis and his authentic followers, will understand this. They rule from the edges and reign from what is no longer the bottom. All right. So here are the discussion questions for the end of chapter 2. Question 1. Growth through suffering versus passive or rebellious believers who outwardly may exhibit growth. Discuss and chart what the manifestations of that would look like. Number 2. Give an example of an area in your life where you may be called to lead from within. And if you're doing this study in a group setting, brainstorm how that can become a reality. Finally, number 3, what areas in your life have you earned the right to minister in an authentic voice or space? All right, my friends, thanks so much for journeying with me. I, too, am loving this conversation about mysticism and the idea of how it can be relevant in today's modern church. Make sure and like and subscribe. Share this with anyone you think would be experiencing some benefit and even some closeness with God through a deeper understanding of how He truly does want to walk with us daily.